Hi, everybody. Today we are going to be doing Domain 9, Lesson 11, The End of the War. This will actually be our last story before we are tested over all of Domain 9, the U.S. Civil War. First, I want to go over a couple of vocab words that are new to us that you will be hearing in today's story. The first new word is equality. Equality is the state of being the same or fairness. A good teacher knows it is important to have equality in the classroom. Next new word is monument. A monument is a structure such as a building or sculpture built as a memorial to a person or event. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. is an amazing monument. The next new word is prosperity. Prosperity is financial success or good fortune. Lana's family experienced greater prosperity with the opening of her parents' new store. The next word is ransacked. We've actually had this word previously. Do you remember when the president's house was ransacked with Dolly Madison still inside? Ransacked means searched through to steal goods or looted. Another example is the news reported a story about a burglar who ransacked a house to steal money but was caught before he could escape. The next word is rival. A rival is a person who is competing for the same object or the same position as another. Linda was Laura's rival in the tennis match. Another good synonym for rival is opponent. The last word we have been using a lot in this domain, and that is the word united. United. United means joined together as one. In the United States, all of the states work together as one country. Do you remember the person who thought it was the most important for us to stay united during the Civil War? If you said Abraham Lincoln, you were right. All right, we are almost ready to get started. One last thing. I want to give you a purpose for listening. That means something to do while you listen to the story. What I want you to do is to listen carefully to find out which side won the war and what happens to the North and the South after the war. So make a prediction now. Who do you think will win? Was it the North, the Union, or was it the South, the Confederacy? All right, here we go. In 1865, news stories did not travel as quickly as they do today. There were no televisions or telephones or even radios. There were newspapers, but the news stories could be about things that happened days or even weeks before. There were also telegraphs, which were short, typed messages that required special skills to read. It could take several days for news to reach soldiers who were miles away from a town or a city with a telegraph wire. It could also take days or even weeks for news to reach their families. In tiny towns all over America, parents, wives, and children of soldiers were waiting for a son, husband, or father to return home from the war. So, on April 9th, 1865, it took a little while for the news to spread that, in a small farmhouse in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Robert E. Lee surrendered the remainder of the Confederate Army. Within days, most other Confederate armies that had been fighting in other parts of the country surrendered as well. The rebel soldiers laid down their weapons, made oaths to give up the rebellion and never fight against the United States again, and walked home. What are oaths? Do you remember? On what side were the rebel soldiers? The Union soldiers were relieved. At last, the long Civil War was ended, and the North had won. What was the North called during the Civil War? It was time to return home, rest, and rebuild the nation. It had taken 4 long years, but the United States was on its way to being united again. United means together as one. Did you predict correctly who would win the war? For the most part, the cities of the North had not been damaged. Why do you think the North was hardly damaged? With the end of the war, Northerners started to think about how to make the country bigger. They focused on building more railroads and spreading westward across the Mississippi River, through Missouri and Kansas, over the Rocky Mountains, and all the way to California. Why do you think people wanted to spread out to the west? For people in the North, life would finally start getting back to normal. They were glad to have something to make in their factories other than weapons and uniforms for the war. Most of the battles had been fought in the South. Southerners were relieved that the war was over as well, even if the Confederacy had lost the war. At least there was no more fighting. Nearly all the towns and cities were now ruined and burned, smashed by cannonballs, and ransacked or searched through by armies in search of food. Farmlands, roads, railroad tracks, and bridges had been destroyed as well. Times were hardest by far in the South after the war. The U.S. government sent money and supplies, as well as soldiers, to keep order and start rebuilding towns and cities. This was called Reconstruction because they were rebuilding or reconstructing the South. But it would take many years before there would be true peace, prosperity, and equality in the South. Prosperity is wealth or good fortune, equality is fairness. For millions of enslaved African Americans in the South, all of this destruction not only meant the end of the war, it meant freedom from a life of slavery. The enslaved Africans were now free people. They could not be forced to work on plantations anymore. They could not be sent away from their families anymore. They were free from slavery and ready to start their lives over again. How do you think it would feel to be a slave and to finally be free? Remember earlier you heard that it took some time for news to travel? Well, it took 2 months for the news that the war had ended to reach African Americans in the state of Texas. The Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19, 1865, to announce the end of the war and the abolition of slavery. When the African American people in Galveston heard the news, they immediately began to celebrate with prayer, feasting, music, and dancing. Today, Juneteenth is a holiday tradition celebrated annually or once a year on June 19th in many states across the country. It is the oldest known celebration recognizing the end of slavery. Many African Americans freed from slavery wanted to get as far away from the South as possible. Why do you think they'd want to get away from the South? Some moved north to cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Washington, D.C. Many arrived with no possessions and no money, nothing but the clothing on their back and the hope for a better life. They worked in factories, built new businesses, and created new neighborhoods, schools, and communities. However, African Americans still faced some of the toughest challenges of all. For although they were free, they still did not have the same rights as white Americans in the North or the South. The end of the Civil War was the beginning of a new age in America. There were still hard times ahead, as well as sadness, but the country was unified as a single nation. The Civil War produced many heroes, including one of the most famous Americans of all, Abraham Lincoln. His face appears today on the penny and the $5 bill. There are thousands of towns, buildings, roads, bridges, tunnels, such as the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, and people named after him. In Washington, D.C., there's a giant monument honoring him called the Lincoln Memorial, as you can see in this picture. 100 years after the Civil War, an African American named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of this Lincoln Memorial and gave the very famous I Have a Dream speech. 100 years after the end of slavery, Dr. King and other African Americans continued to work and struggle for fair treatment and equal rights. Throughout the Civil War, Harriet Tubman continued risking her life to free enslaved people and end slavery. During some battles, she also worked as a nurse and sometimes as a spy for the Union Army. Because Harriet Tubman knew the roads and secret trails around Maryland, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, she was able to spy on the Confederate Army, telling Union generals in which direction the army was going and how many men they had.